about fears. Let's talk about love. Yeah, I got fears, but I ain't got no love.
Okay, welcome back to Unsolved No More. Here with another deep dive. Been hitting these kind of hard lately because I have time to do them, and I enjoy looking at them, especially these old cases, as you know. This one comes from 1973. The age of the serial murderer, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is done by a serial murderer. This is the story of Debra Makel. She was 8 years old and she was in the 3rd grade. She got dropped off after school by the bus, walking home, which is, I mean, as you can see by the map, there's a bus stop there, or like a, you know, they used to have like little shelters for the kids. And she's dropped off there and then has to walk back a dead-end street. This is all very important information. Where the house is located, how it's located, meaning with a few neighbors, dead-end street. That's very important in making this assessment. But she got off the bus, she made it to the house, and then she disappeared until her body was found 2 days later. About 200 yards from her house in a wooded area. Autopsy revealed that she was killed by strangulation and she was sexually assaulted. The strangulation, of course, is of major importance. When you have somebody that's died of strangulation, you really want to look at what type of strangulation, whether it's manual or it's ligature. That's very important. And in this case, it was ligature. So that is the overall gist of the case. Now this case is from Pennsylvania once again, and for some reason I didn't write down the city here of where it was. Which is unusual, but my mind has been bustling lately. But I know this was in Pennsylvania, and I want to say it was close to Pittsburgh, but not in the city. I think it was certainly on the outskirts of the city, but the name is just not coming to me. So again, this happened, she disappeared on a Friday, October 5th, 1973. When you're working on these type of cases, and I seem to, I was going to say, I tend to do more of these child type cases because they get to me more, as they do everybody else. Especially when you look at victimology, and as we will in this, and most children, you know, I'm going to say 90%, depending on their parents, are low risk, meaning they didn't do anything in their life to warrant them being a victim. Yet there's certain socio-economical and proclivities that always play into it. The child is almost usually never at fault, and they're usually never going to be a high-risk victim unless, you know, as we talked about before, they're born into sex trafficking, born into a drug culture, things like that. But it's usually, you know, 99%, it's never the child's fault. So when you look at these child cases, and I guess, you know, a lot of times it isn't the victim's fault, right? They didn't do anything wrong, even if it's an adult male. Sometimes they do. But These child cases, especially the missing ones, I just feel a little bit more for the family. But in this case, the child was missing, but she was found. What I find remarkable about this case is that the parents still live in the exact same house. And I'm not sure if they're still alive. I believe they are. Same house where this happened. A lot of times you will find that the parents will move. And that didn't happen here. So I just thought that that was a curious little side note. So let's get into the case. So little Debbie Makel, she goes to school. She's riding home on the bus. Normally, she had two brothers, older brothers, that would ride home the bus with her. On this particular day, the two older brothers got permission to walk home from the school because they wanted to sell candy or some sort of, I believe, school function event, like a magazine subscription, something. Debbie wanted to go with. She was told no because she was too young, which was a school, I guess, regulation. And so she had to take the bus home. That's key, number one. But also, too, is that from the boys' positioning, they actually saw Debbie get off the bus. That's important. And start walking. Now, Debbie is next picked up by her neighbor, who watches her go in the house. That's the last Debbie's seen. Until she's found deceased Sunday, 2 days later at 11:30 a.m. Two cousins found her. Family members, there was a big search. On Friday night, when she didn't return home from supper, maybe even made an announcement at the local football game to get volunteers to come help. So Debbie makes it into the house. We know this not only from that neighbor, but also her coat and her books were found in that house. So she made it home. A basement door was found open. Oh, what's going on here? I'm losing my focus. There we go. Basement door open. That's all the evidence. There was some talk of some plums that were delivered earlier in the day by Debbie's grandfather, and they had been moved. I can only assume that they brought grandfather back into that home to look to see if anything was, but it doesn't mean the offender moved, the plums. Debbie could have. She made it home. So I don't see the significance too much into that. But where Debbie is found, like I said, was 200 yards or so, 3/4 mile, something like that, or quarter mile from her house. Now, if you look at her house and you see, it's very important to look at the layout of this house, the outside, how it's situated. You see the back of the house, how it's all wooded. A couple houses on that lane that's there. The body was found in that wooded section. It was actually like an old distillery of some sort that had a rock foundation. She was found hastily buried, but she was buried. By hastily, I mean branches, leaves, some dirt over top of her. All this is very important in your assessments. So where do we start? Well, we start with getting a drink of ice water. We already talked about victimology of the child. Now we got to talk about the parents. The location of the house. Is it in a drug-infested area or a bad crime area? No. Parents, were they in? Listen, nobody knows with skeletons in people's closets, all right? But on all outward appearances, parents are on the up and up. Dad was, I believe, a teacher. Mom worked also. So normally, Debbie and the kids would get off, and they would be at home for a couple hours most before Mom would get home, and then Dad would get home. Nothing unusual, okay? Same with this particular day, Friday, October 5th. Debbie's getting home. Her mom's going to be there shortly. And when Mom did arrive, she sees no Debbie, but she didn't panic. Sometimes Debbie, oftentimes, would play with the neighbors and stuff like that. Brothers got home shortly after Mom, and then Dad. When Debbie didn't make it home, they didn't see nothing of her. At supper time is when they got worried. And that's when calls are starting to be made. A lot of times, you have these, I don't even want to say amateur detectives, you just have these people who automatically want to lash out at the parents by saying, oh, I'd never leave my kid at home, and I would never. It's not about what you would do. It's about what was done. Okay? Hindsight is always 20/20. I am sure. Let's say think of Adam Walsh. And let's just say you are in a department store. Your child is there reading a book at the bookstore. And you go 3 aisles over to look at the home gardening section. Stay right there, Jimmy. Come back, Jimmy's gone. Okay? You will still have idiots that will say, well, I would never even have left my kid alone there. Let's say the kid was 13 years old. But they got abducted. Somebody came in and said, hey, don't I know you? Hey, I got this thing out here for you. And they follow, and that's it. It happens. You can't criticize the parents for it. In this case, you have both parents that are working. Now, if both parents were out doing crack cocaine, 2 blocks away and left their kids unattended, well, yeah, then you can blame them. Here you have 2 hardworking parents. Nothing in their background to indicate that they're irresponsible, that they did anything wrong. This was a normal day. Yet something happened. But what? Okay, let's not get into deduction just yet. Let's get into the evidence, which is minimal. Okay, at the house, you have the basement door ajar. That's key number 1. Okay. Now, some people will say, well, the child liked to play. No. Simplify it. Okay? She's going to shut the door. There's that off chance she's going to shut the door. She made it home. That's it. That's it at the house. That we know, that I see. Okay? That's released to the public. But that is not the only evidence, okay? Here you have a second crime scene location. It's the body dump. Those are crime scene locations too. Because why? There's evidence there. Not only the body is evidence of a crime, there's certain things that could be left there. In this case, there was. Okay? She had a pillowcase over her head. Now, where that pillowcase come from, I would love to know. Whether it was from the house or if the offender brought it. Remember I told you manual versus ligature strangulation. I think of this in the Teresa Corley case. If you go back and watch my week-long video on that. Ligatures, manual strangulation is usually the act of impulse. You made me angry. It's almost like a weapon of opportunity. Not always. A lot of times, deviant sexual offenders will get off by manual strangulation. But when you have ligature strangulation, to me, that is more indicative of a planned event. Now, unless, think of Bob Crane. Kind of a bad example, but still, where a lamp cord, was a lamp cord used in that? Think of a case where a lamp and the cord is wrapped around somebody's neck and they're strangled with it. That's different. Yes, that's ligature strangulation, but that's a weapon of opportunity. That's not pre-planned. Usually, I'm going to go as high as 90% of the time. If you find a person who is murdered with ligature strangulation in the woods, it's a pre-planned event. I mean, yes, you could pick up a hitchhiker. She could do something that makes you mad, and you decide to kill her, and you look around and you find a string or a shoelace. But that is not... You wouldn't rely on that, okay? Ligature strangulation is like a kill kit, okay? You have certain items because you plan on killing somebody. That's what I see here. Now, there are different choices of what that ligature was. Meaning, in each different report that I read, one said it was a heavy cord. One said it was twine. I want to know. If it's twine, even if it's heavy cord, but twine intrigues me. Because what's twine used for, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, of course, is, and still today, hay, straw. I would be very curious to any farms in the area. But if it's a heavy cord, that's different. Those are the little things that newspapers just get wrong, and it infuriates me. Nothing has changed. You can't believe anything the media says anymore. I guess you never could. But I remember in the past we used to take it for granted. You know, they would know what they're talking about, but not the case here. It was determined that her blue pair of underwear, her shoes, and her purse were missing. That's important too. It leads me to believe two things. One, that she may not have been killed at that location, although I think that is of lower statistical value than they were kept as souvenirs. And the reason I say she wasn't killed at that location is because Friday night, Saturday, that location was searched. And by all accounts, people said she was not there. That reminds me of the Alonzo Brooks case. Now, and there was another case that I covered on here. I mean, Maura Murray comes to mind too. You have to imagine, it's almost a needle in a haystack. Okay? You have a third grader whose body's this big. Okay? And you are searching hundreds of acres of woods. I mean, you have to come right across it. People act like it's impossible to miss. Oh, Delphi. That's the case I was thinking of. Where people think that the bodies were moved and then brought back to a location. 2 of them. just asinine thinking. Okay? No, they were just missed. They were missed. Debra Makel was missed. No matter how impossible you think that is, it happens. She was missed. It's not like she was just laying above the ground. She was buried. The two cousins that found her saw a little sliver of green sticking out, and they investigated. So she was missed. She was there the whole time. But her clothing not being there, to me, leads me to believe of a trophy. But that's a lot to take. Okay? When a serial offender, or not even a serial offender, just somebody who wants to relive that experience of what they did and takes a trophy, it would be, and I use quotes because I got a comment a couple of times about why would they have a trophy on them. A trophy meaning something that is tangible, that links that person, who the offender's experience, to what they just did to that victim. So they'll take a driver's license. They'll take a sock, underwear. Here you have shoes, underwear, and a purse. I don't believe that they're all trophies. That doesn't make sense. The underwear, yes, I believe. But shoes, purse, who knows? They could have been discarded somewhere else. They could have been buried. I doubt that once they found the child's body, I know that they did a search for other evidence. I'm sure of it. Maybe it was buried and it was never found. Something to that extent. Again, the pillowcase over the head, that could have been done from the house. But it could also have been done at the scene of the sexual assault and put over the face because of remorse. And it makes sense because we'll get into the assessment and how I think this happened. Again, go back to the house, the driveway, the neighbors. The neighbors saw the child go in the house. Don't you think the neighbor or neighbors would notice an unfamiliar car coming down their driveway? It's a private dead-end lane. And there's only, 3 houses on there? 2 houses? With the Makels being the last one? If the neighbors saw a child go into the house, don't you think, number one, they would have seen a car come down there? And if they missed that car because they were doing dishes, they were sleeping, whatever, don't you think they would see it leave? If not, don't you think they would see it sitting there? The time frame that this happened is very quick. You're talking 3:50 when she got to that house to when the parents got home, 4:30. The person that did this, in my training and experience, is somebody that knows Debbie. It is definitely not an outsider. And the person who did it was on foot. Now, how can I determine that? Number one, as I just said, a car would have been spotted. A car would have definitely been spotted coming down that short, one-way, dead-end road. Gravel road. They came on foot. Now, where did they come on foot? Again, I don't believe they came down through the front of the house. Look at the back of the house. The basement door's back there. The woods are back there. She was found back there. The offender came from back there. So it's my belief that the offender would have came through those woods I believe he was in the house when this assault took place. Or the kidnapping. The abduction. He takes her from that house, leads her out the back door, through those woods, because nobody can see really back there. I mean, I wasn't there. I would love to go to the neighbor's house and be able to say, hey, can you see in that backyard and this and that? But that's the most likely route. That's the most likely place because a car wasn't seen, an offender wasn't seen, and the victim is found back there. Now, I don't believe that he kidnapped the victim, as some people do. They abduct Debbie, take her to a house, assault her, and then bring her back 200 yards from her house. The offender, that didn't happen. That did not happen. The same way with Delphi. It didn't happen. You are not going to bring a victim's body back to the abduction site and risk getting caught. You already have them out of the area. Okay? Why would you bring them back to where the search is concentrated on? It makes zero sense. No, she was led out of the back of the house to that foundation where she was sexually assaulted. Right there. Probably within feet of where her remains were found. Her body. Right there. And it's a foundation. It's somebody. It's an old, like it's not really, it was a building at one point in time. Somebody knew that was there. That's a landmark. And then somebody had said that in the newspaper article, it might even have been a police officer, that they felt that Debbie, the offender wanted Debbie to be found. And that's the reason she was found 200 yards from her house. Buddy, I know it was 1973, but if you believe that, man, you got to find another means of income. Okay? I mean, the offender buried her. He buried her. How could he want her to be found? If he wanted her to be found, wouldn't he take the body and put it back in the house? No, he didn't want her to be found. The sexual assault happened right there. And he buried her right there. He could care less about her family, or whether she's found. But I believe it was somebody that Debbie knew. I keep going back. I'm sure the victim or the offender was in that house. But how did the offender know that Debbie was going to be alone? That's key here. Because what was he going to do? Control 3 children? He could have, but boy, that's very risky, right? Because every other day, besides Friday, the brothers and Debbie would arrive. But on this day, something's different. The brothers don't accompany the sister. And that's the day she's taken. Now, remember, I do believe in coincidences. But not this one. If you're deducing, if you're deducing everything the way that I just did, the offender arrived on foot. He arrived from the back through that wooded area. He knew that. He knew Debbie. And he also knew that Debbie was going to be alone that day in that short window of time from when she's dropped off, from when mom gets home. Where do you got to look at? You got to look at that school, or the families of people in that school who knew that those boys were not going to be there that day. That's how you have to deduce this. So, who knew that the boys asked for permission to walk home that day, to give that fender that opportunity. He more than likely was watching Debbie for a long time, waiting for the moment to strike. And this is pre-planned because of the ligature, remember? If she's killed out in those woods, what, he's going to look around for a piece of twine, a rope that he hopes is going to be there? You know, more than likely, when he came from where he did, he could have drove to that back section of woods in the back of the house. Yes. And then got out and walked through the woods up to the house, abducted her, and brought back. He more than likely stashed his kit, his kill kit, there at that foundation. Or the rope. Okay? Whoever did this he gets satisfaction from that type of violence. Okay? He could easily strangle this 8-year-old with his hands. But he uses a ligature. Now, where this gets tricky is this, let's say this is an inexperienced offender. And he doesn't know that it's very hard to strangle somebody with your hands. She had a crushed larynx. Now, could that have come from him trying to kill by strangulation? And it's just not working. So instead he grabs a ligature. Yes. But that ligature would have to be a weapon of opportunity. You know what would make that scenario more believable? If he grabbed a rock and bashed her head in. That makes sense. Foundations, there's rocks all over the place. But it's a ligature. A piece of the statistical I don't even know the word I'm looking for here. The percentage of it being a piece of cord or twine happened to lay within, arm's length of the offender to use it as a weapon of opportunity is minuscule. I just don't see that. A rock, yes. But a ligature, no. That's pre-planned. He had that there. And he intended to use that on her. And he did. Alright. What to look for in the offender. I mean, again, a young offender, teenager, is a possibility. And the reason I say that is because of someone having to know that those boys were walking home. But it doesn't feel like it. It feels to me that this is, I shouldn't even say feels, because it's not evidence. Okay? It's somebody that knows that family and knew that those boys were not going to be there. And he was pretty comfortable in breaking into that home and waiting for her. I mean, I feel that he was in that home without a doubt. It's the only thing that makes sense in that short window of time. And that's scary, isn't it? Come home from work, doing your normal deeds, knowing somebody's in there watching you. I'm sitting here thinking of how he got her out of that house. I mean, it doesn't take much for an 8th grader, but you got to be able to intimidate a little bit. Now, how? It's either done because she knows who that person is and she doesn't feel threatened, which is a good possibility, or he had a weapon. The thing that bothers me is if he had a knife and threatened the child with a knife and led her through those woods at knife point, why wouldn't he use that knife? Just like West Memphis 3, when they say Damien Eccles or whoever, Jason Baldwin, scraped the bodies with the serrated edge of that knife. That makes no sense to me. If they had a knife, they would use a knife, especially juveniles. So I think of that here. The only thing that makes sense to me is if the offender had a knife and took her out of the house by threat of knife, and he doesn't kill her by knife, instead he uses strangulation. That is a sexually motivated, I mean, we already know this is a sexually motivated crime, but it enhances that. So he could have a gun and lead her out. That's possible, and not use the gun, use the ligature. Or she knew him and wasn't threatened. But if that was the case, I don't think you would see that back door left open. But could he have threatened her without any weapons? Yes, it's possible. But the offender does not know what he's going to encounter. He has to be prepared. What if one of the parents decided to come or just show up early? If the offender is smart enough to pre-plan this, he had to have been thinking about that and say, you know what? I'm not going into this house unarmed. I'm going to have a knife, or I'm going to have a gun. He's not going in with a piece of twine. No. Okay? So he either had a knife or he had a gun. Or, now, I'm not even going to say she knew him and felt comfortable, because that back door, basement door, would have been shut. That back basement door is open because he's leading her out, tells her, he's behind her, open the door, don't make a sound. She opens the door, they go out, he doesn't bother to shut it. He can't be bothered with it. He's focused on her. Knife or gun, I can't determine which. But rest assured, it was one of them. And he didn't use it. He used the ligature because that's what got him off. Definitely a sexually motivated crime. Motivated by deviant sexual behavior. Okay? Without a doubt. Go through my notes here. Made it home, her books, her keys, her coat was in the house, the dead end road, found 200 yards from the house. Cold case investigators take this over. And they said in a recent development they have DNA, which is phenomenal. Of course, they run it through CODIS and there's no match. I want to know what type of DNA that is, whether it's semen or whether it's touch DNA. I've worked on older cases like this where the evidence wasn't handled so great. And so a lot of people touched it, and you can't rely on touch DNA. I'm just iffy on touch DNA. If it's blood or if it's semen, well, that's a different freaking story. That's a whole new ballgame. So they have DNA, which is phenomenal. Phenomenal. It's just there's no match. Think of the last case I did where they went, that great detective, cold case detective from the Kirsten Hatfield, went back and got DNA samples from neighbors. And it was determined that the neighbor that lived 2 doors down was the offender. They need to do the same thing here. Go back. I'm guessing that they interviewed this guy, at least in a neighborhood canvas. I'd be looking to... It's somebody within that school district. We could at least narrow it down to that. Okay? And go back and start getting DNA from those people. Voluntarily. Just go up and get a cheek swab. I had a murder case, double murder one time, and I must have cheek swabbed 150 people. within a month period. Just went and kept going and going and going. The lab hated me. Oh well, do your job. Don't even get me started on Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. That ruined one of my cases. But I digress. This was the story of Debra Makel. I hope someone out there takes notice to this video and does the right thing. If they were a witness, were afraid to say something. Now remember, allegiances change, alliances change, friendships change, people get divorced. What was important to you when you were 22 and now that you're 62? Completely different. Okay? Completely different. So, do the right thing. Come forward if you have information on this murder. My assessment, I feel very confident about in this case. Somebody in that house, not in that, an offender from the outside was in that house when Debbie arrived. They abducted her with a weapon, led her off to those woods, which they knew. They know those woods. They knew that distillery was there, where they had their kill kit. They assaulted her, buried her right there, and then went on their way. Most likely by car, I'm guessing. But they parked back there. Parked in those woods. And then drove probably within 5 to 10 miles tops. That's where this offender is going to be. And if he did offend before, he's never been caught. This doesn't seem like this would have been his first victim. Could have been. But if he had urges like that then, those urges continue. You can only suppress them for so long. Little Debbie was not an enemy. Remember, greed, sex, revenge. Get rid of greed, get rid of revenge. This is a sexually motivated crime. So whoever did this has done this since. Check people who moved from that area. That does not necessarily happen, but that's a good place to start. That's my thoughts on Debra Makel. Horrible case. As always, my thoughts and prayers go to the victims' families. And I just hope someday that they get, if closure is just a bad term, resolution. It'll never be the same. Right? Even if somebody's caught, you still lost your 8-year-old child. You know, you'll never be the same. But at least it makes things a little bit better. Because you know, and you're not always wondering who did this. That's all you can hope for. So with that said, Main's out.
Yeah, let's talk about